Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever and whenever you might be listening to this podcast. Welcome to Pop and Politics. I am your host, Andres Bocanegra. Today on the podcast, we will take a look at student loan debt in this country and the benefits of providing at least some forgiveness of debt obligations to borrowers. The topic of student loan forgiveness became a pretty hot debate topic during the Democratic presidential primary, and as the days go on, seems to become increasingly necessary. And of course, you also have those who are opposed to forgiving student loan debt. This is particularly the personal responsibility crowd. And of course, as with anything in our current political climate, this has become an increasingly partisan issue. But we will explore the benefits that loan forgiveness will have, not just for borrowers, but to our now pandemic-riddled economy. That's all coming up now on episode number 4 of Pop and Politics. All right, so let's get into the topic this week, and we're going to start here at the top with a little bit of full disclosure. So, full disclosure, I myself went to college. I graduated from undergraduate school from the University of Texas, San Antonio in 2009. I then went back to school in 2015 to Southern New Hampshire for my master's degree in business, and I graduated in 2017. Now, my family didn't have a lot of money saved up for school. They had some, but not a lot. And they did help me with some expenses while I was in school. Now, academically and even financially, I didn't qualify for many scholarships. And so the majority of my education was funded through loans. And again, in the effort of full disclosure, I do have a somewhat significant amount of student loan debt that I have been repaying since I left school, with some deferments on occasion when I had employment changes or when I re-enrolled in school, etc. So yes, today's topic and the idea of forgiving student loan debt would benefit me in some ways, but it's not necessarily my motivation for discussing it here today. But there you go. Just giving you full disclosure right off the top. So let's take a look at the background of the issue here. Over the last decade, the student loan debt crisis has sort of loomed large over many aspects of higher education. And it has become such a major issue in society and politics as a whole. And the reason being is you have about 45 million Americans who currently owe some form of student loan debt. And that's about 14 to 15% of the US population. And the rapid increase over the last decade in student borrowing is a result of decades, and it shouldn't come as a shock, decades of reduction in government funding of education. And this disinvestment in education has shifted the burden and cost of education more and more onto students and families, and has actually left colleges and universities depending on students and families for funding. Currently, looking at the total here, student loan debt amounts to just over $1.5 trillion. To put that into some context for you, when people say that's a lot of money, the government right now, Congress, is debating a $3 trillion stimulus package for coronavirus COVID-19 relief. So putting that into some context. But student loan debt is greater than almost all other types of household debt except for mortgages. And so it is greater than vehicle debt, it's greater than credit card debt, etc. But what's different about student loan debt comparing to other types of household debt is that borrowers are more likely, much more likely, to be in distress. So you have nearly 25%, nearly 1 in 4 borrowers struggling to pay their loan or in some form of default. And when someone falls behind on their loan payments or defaults, there's very negative consequences for them. There's negative hits on their credit report, their wages can be withheld, etc. Right? And when you get into that position, when you default on your loan, there really aren't a lot of options to help you fix the problem once you get there. And it's such a big deal, but I can already hear the personal responsibility crowd, the Republicans, the conservatives, who think that student loan forgiveness is just another way for some sort of liberal BS, whatever. I can hear it from here. Arguments like, if you couldn't afford the loans in the first place, you shouldn't have done them. You should have gone to a cheaper school. You shouldn't have borrowed more than you could have paid. You should have gotten a degree in a career that pays more. On and on and on and on. Completely losing sight of the fact that society has changed since the 1950s. But yeah, there's some truth to those arguments. But you have to remember a couple of things. Currently, in our economy, which does not work equally for everyone, some families don't have a lot of money saved to send their children to college. And kids who are deciding to go to college and deciding to borrow money to go to college are around the age of 18. So borrowing thousands of dollars to go to college doesn't seem real at this point, especially when you get told, you don't have to pay it now. You'll pay it when you graduate. And that's like 4 years from now. And it seems so far off when you're 18. But then you graduate when you're, 21, 22 years old, and you have thousands and thousands of dollars of debt. So when they make this decision, they may not be making the best decision. But here's where it's impacted our society. You now have an entire generation of Americans, and soon to be 2 generations of Americans, who are making life decisions much differently than previous generations because of their debt burden. Right? It's not if you want to buy a house. It's not if you want to have a child. It's not if you want to do something. It's if you can afford to. Between the loan debt and increase in cost of living across the country, you have many millennials and soon many Generation Z Americans who feel frozen in place, not really able to improve their stations in life. Bringing it back to today's context, Donald Trump talks about pent-up demand, being able to rescue our economy following this COVID-19 pandemic. But I would also argue that if millions of Americans, the 45 million Americans who have student loan debt, were suddenly unburdened, it stands to reason, and we're not even necessarily talking about fully unburdening all student loan debt, even if you did a portion, you would suddenly have millions of Americans who have significant pent-up desires and wants to spend that would be unleashed on this economy, to put it in the president's terms, like you've never seen before. You would have a lot of people who would be more likely to have kids, more people who would be more likely to buy a house, more people who would be likely to start a business. Some very positive things. And in the short term, very positive things for the housing market. But that's not according to me. According to the National Association of Realtors, Lawrence Yun with the National Association of Realtors, granted before the pandemic, right? But he said that if home sales if people were not saddled with large student loan debt, home sales could be upwards of over 300,000 per year. And that would have been, and still could be, a significant boost to the housing market and to the economy as a whole. But you have an entire generation, some of whom are living at home with their parents, delaying buying a home. And buying a home buying is the most typical and most powerful way for middle-class people to build wealth. Donald Trump should know that, right? And lots of senators and congressmen in government should know that, because that's how their families built wealth, right? Donald Trump's father built wealth through real estate. That's supposedly how Donald Trump built his wealth, through real estate. Real estate, home buying is the most typical and most powerful way for middle-class people to build wealth generationally. And you now have an entire generation, and again, soon to be 2 generations of Americans who are delaying that process. The long-term effects of that could be really, really negative for the country. And again, not just limiting this to home buying. You would also see an economic boost that would go far beyond just the housing market. You have financial firm Moody's that says that U.S. gross domestic product would increase an additional $86 to $108 billion a year, and that's if we had total loan forgiveness. And that's a significant boost to the economy every year. Every year. Now, even more important now, during this pandemic riddled economy that we will have once this COVID-19 pandemic kind of ends. Now, in fairness, in the short term, at least, this may be a negative, of course, for the federal budget. That's because the majority of loans that are outstanding are from the federal government itself. So we're giving $1.5 trillion in student loan debt would mean that the government would give up on about $85 billion a year in revenue. But again, the flip side of that argument is that that $85 billion a year in revenue would be put back into the economy. And that's the argument Republicans use when they cut taxes. They cut taxes, they cut revenue, right? When you cut taxes, you're cutting revenue that comes into the federal government. But they tell you that those cuts in revenue will be made up by the boost to the economy, that we would see more revenue over time. So if it's good enough for tax cuts, it should be good enough for debt forgiveness. But again, that would have to, of course, be made up somewhere. Now, of course, you have doctors and lawyers who typically have the highest level of student loan debt, but they also stand to likely earn more money in the future and in the long run. So many people generally oppose what they see as a giveaway to those types of borrowers. And of course, it probably wouldn't be a great idea to tax working class Americans to pay off student loan debt for higher income borrowers. So that's why you see many candidates in the primary race proposing paying for student loan forgiveness with some form of tax on the wealthy. This tax would likely, according to Moody's, create less drag on the economy. Most notably, in the Democratic primary, you had Elizabeth Warren, who wanted to impose a wealth tax on people earning more than $50 million a year. 2 cents on every dollar. 2 cents on every dollar, calling it the ultra millionaire tax. 2%, which works out to 2 cents for every dollar. It's a small tax on people who make more than $50 million a year. If, according to her, if we implemented something like that, you would see the government bring in $4 trillion. More than enough to pay for the $1.5 trillion in student loan debt, and enough to adequately fund education, enough to adequately help rebuild the middle class, and to help the middle class build itself up. But of course, because she's a Democrat, and of course, because everything is seen through the lens of politics, it's not really a proposal that a lot of people got behind in the personal responsibility crowd. But I digress. But I would argue it's a great idea, because the spending habits of the wealthy would be far less influenced by that kind of change than someone in a lower tax bracket or a lower income bracket, right? For example, if you were to tax my income at 2 cents on every dollar, that's going to hurt me a lot more than someone who makes $50 million a year. So there's that concern there. But I think if you write it out well, if you write out the legislation well to do this, and you clean up the tax code to make it a lot more streamlined, I think you find a lot of positives for doing it. But here's the other argument that people have against this. It's this idea that you create a moral hazard by doing this, that future students might take on even more debt than they would now, simply because they expect that there would be additional loan forgiveness later. And yes, that certainly is a possibility. But I think if you have a significant effort to pair loan forgiveness with adequate funding of all levels of education and adequate funding of public education, not private schools, not charter schools, but all levels of education, public education, including public universities, including public colleges, students would have to take out less and less in loans because their universities and colleges would have to rely on them less and less for funding. And you have to remember, the idea of free college, right? Some dismiss it as an idea, a socialist idea from Bernie Sanders, the self-acclaimed democratic socialist. And, it might as well just be tantamount to communism in this country to have any sort of idea of free college, even reducing the cost of college through adequate funding of education. But it's really not that far-fetched. But where does an idea like that get traction? So when you look at the cost of attending college between 1995 and 2015, so most of the people that argue against free college, most of the people that argue against student loan forgiveness, they all went to college before 1995, give or take, most likely. But between those 2 decades, between 1995 and 2015, when you look at around 300 universities, tuition and fees rise significantly. Private schools see an increase of over 180%. And public universities being state universities and colleges, saw an increase of more than 225%. That's more than triple the cost in just over 2 decades. I graduated in 2009, and in the 10 years since I left undergraduate school, the cost of attending my undergrad school is significantly higher than when I entered in 2004. So even in just the last decade, the cost has grown exponentially. So when you have older generations, the ones who went to college in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s, even the 80s, when you have these older generations comparing their college experience, their experience buying a home in the 80s, and the cost of college in their time, right? Back in my day, to compare that to today's generation, to compare that to the millennials, to compare that to the Generation Z, it's ridiculous. It's like comparing apples and tacos. They're not even close to being similar. They're not even both fruits. So making the comparison because you went to college at some point, it's not the same. But let's give you a little history lesson here. I am a history teacher, after all. Going back to the 19th century, right? That sounds super long time ago, and it is. So you're talking about the late 1800s, early 1900s. College education was mostly free. And the reason being, right, during the 19th century, college was generally free because college was seen as training students from middle-class backgrounds in things like being a high school teacher, being a minister, being a community leader, who after graduation would serve the public need, serve the public good. And there was this perception about the role of higher education, the role of college. College education was considered a public good because a student who received an education would put it to use for the better of society. So everyone in society benefited when people chose to go to college. Society was willing to pay for it because it was for the good of society as a whole. And again, this goes back to a point we've talked about the last couple of episodes. We no longer view each other as part of a whole, as part of a whole society. We are all out for ourselves. Stanford University was founded on the premise of offering college education free of charge to residents in California. It did not charge any tuition for nearly 3 decades, between 1891 and 1920. You had the College of William and Mary offering tuition scholarships in exchange for an agreement that a student would engage in some type of service after graduation. And this goes back to 1888. William and Mary provided full tuition to about a third of its students in exchange for teaching 2 years at a public school in Virginia. And even though during that period of time, the cost of college raised dramatically, those costs should not have been passed on to students. That's according to Harvard president Charles Eliot. He said, "I want to have the college open equally to people with money, little money, or no money, provided they all have brains." So provided that they would all put in the work and provided that they would all do something that benefited society, the increased cost of education should not be passed on to students. But the perception of college, of higher education, changes dramatically. Beginning around 1910, 1920, private colleges start to see more students from upper class families, from wealthier families, who go to college for the social experience and not necessarily for learning. And so this change leads to a shift in the purpose of education. What was once seen as a public good was now something to make yourself look better. right? To tell people you went to college, sort of the cachet of having a degree. So young people aren't entering college in this period to do something for the betterment of society. They're doing it to fulfill a personal goal, make themselves feel better, and enjoying the social setting of private colleges, and somehow obtaining a respected profession upon graduation, right? So eventually the goal is to make money. So in the end of the 1920s, John Rockefeller begins to push that students should be charged the full cost it takes to educate them. And he suggested that students could shoulder those costs through student loans. And that campaign is quite successful. They convinced donors, educators, college administrators that students should pay for their own education because going to college was considered a, quote, deeply personal affair. Tuition and student loans became very commonly accepted aspects in the economics of higher education. So the shift in attitude regarding college education has become widely accepted. So if the United States wants to look for alternatives to this failing funding model of college affordability, you have to go back further than the 30s. You have to go back further than the 20s. We need to change the idea. We need to reframe the idea of college. And maybe that's not for everyone, right? Maybe you help those who will go into professions that benefit society, teachers, doctors, nurses, and maybe those who are going to go in professions that are simply about making money, maybe going into oil and gas and business, maybe they pay more of their share of college education. Higher education today is about what college can do for you. It's not about what college students can do for the country. Tuition-free education and student loan forgiveness can only happen if we reframe public education and college education as a public good. So we'd have to change this idea. We would have to reform and reshape society and society's idea of what college education should be for. And that's a bigger conversation. But in the short term, forgiving student loan debt has a major impact on those who currently are saddled with huge debts. Something new and why this is becoming increasingly important during the COVID-19 pandemic is people are losing their jobs. We are in Great Depression era job losses and unemployment. So you do have two Democratic House representatives introducing legislation that would forgive $30,000 in debt for borrowers during the coronavirus outbreak. It's a bill called the Student Debt Relief Act, and it would prevent the government from seizing wages and Social Security checks of borrowers who are now in default. So this is still something that's out there, still something that has gained traction. In the Senate, right now you have a proposal going around about forgiving $10,000 of student debt for each borrower. And the Republicans, the Trump administration, coming out with very moderate proposals, waiving payments, pausing borrowers' bills for 60 days, more of a forbearance. But I think in the short term, of course, during this coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic, there's a benefit. But in the long term, as we come out of this pandemic, forgiving student loan debt has the potential to unleash a lot of what the president would call pent-up demand that would really benefit our economy. The times have changed. We need to shift our thinking here. I've asked this question before in previous episodes. Do we want to continue living in an us society where we are all in this for ourselves? Or do we want to shift to a way of thinking of what can we do for others? Do we want to live in a we society? Or do we want to live in an us society? Because the us society that we've been living in doesn't work for everyone. It doesn't work. You still have people who it took 2 weeks, one paycheck, missing one paycheck, put them in financial ruin. So you have families who live paycheck to paycheck. You have families who one health emergency would put them into bankruptcy. You have families who can't really afford to send their kids to college, so their kids have to get more and more student loan debt. You're not funding public education, so the cost of college continues to skyrocket. Our system does not work evenly or equally for everyone. And so in the short term, there would be a lot to figure out. But in the long term, student loan debt forgiveness and public education funding, especially funding, proper, adequate funding of post-secondary education, would go a long way to truly benefiting and improving society as a whole. But those are just my thoughts. All right, so that will do it for this week's episode of Pop and Politics. I hope you've enjoyed today's show. Trying to do things that aren't so political necessarily, and also trying to avoid a lot of topics about like Donald Trump or coronavirus, COVID-19, and trying to do some more general topics. So we'll keep working on those. Obviously, if you did a podcast just about Donald Trump or just about COVID-19, it would be a little difficult because those things change each and every day, and sometimes they're hard to keep up with. You could literally do a podcast every day on something new that the president said. We will talk about some of those topics that have come up over the last couple of weeks with the president, so look for those as well. Again, you can get this podcast on Spotify and on Google Podcasts, hopefully soon on some other platforms. And of course, we are starting to upload these as well to YouTube, so be sure to subscribe. Thanks so much for listening in this week. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for joining me. This has been Pop and Politics.